Okay, let's unpack this. When you think about the story of European involvement in India, one name just, it dominates everything.
Oh, Britain. It's always Britain.
Exactly. You picture the massive Raj, the English language, the architecture.
London as the center of the universe, basically.
Yeah.
The political and economic center of gravity for the whole subcontinent.
Right. And that story, I mean, it's fundamentally true, of course, but it's also deeply incomplete.
That's our mission for this deep dive. We're trying to pull back the curtain on all these parallel non-British narratives, the alternative histories of South Asia.
We're talking about a past where the whole region could have ended up speaking French, but with a strange South Asian accent.
Or where Paris, maybe even Lisbon, could have been the capital of South Asian politics.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating what if.
So for this, we're pulling from an incredible stack of sources, everything from, say, 17th century travelogues and corporate minutes,
Yeah.
all the way to modern geopolitical analyses.
And we're focusing on the big players, of course.
Yeah.
The Portuguese, the Dutch, the French.
But we're also digging into some of the more exotic minor players, like the Danes, the Swedes, even the Austrians. They all left these surprisingly durable marks
And, well, you have to start where the European story in Asia really begins,
with the Portuguese.
with the Portuguese, yeah. Late 15th century. We can, move pretty quickly past Vasco da Gama to the real empire builder, a guy called Afonso de Albuquerque. He laid the foundation for everything that followed.
Which means we start in Goa. It's probably still the biggest tourist destination in India today.
It is. And Albuquerque seized it in the early 16th century. It became the enduring heart of Portuguese power in the entire Indian Ocean.
But here's a crucial detail. Portugal's power, at least initially, it wasn't based on conquering vast territories, was it?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
It was all about trade mediation. They essentially took control of the critical sea route to the Spice Islands. They were the middlemen.
The go-between for the Middle East, South Asia, and Southeast Asia.
Exactly. It was huge money, but it also defined their structure. It was, for all intents and purposes, an empire without territory.
Okay, so if that's the case, if it's an empire built only on mediation, why did the massive land empires, like the Mughals, why did they tolerate the Portuguese building these fortified enclaves like Goa or Daman and Diu?
Because they just didn't see them as a political threat. Not really.
They were just merchants.
They were merchants. The Mughals were so vast, so militarily dominant on land. They basically saw the Europeans as Farang's despicable, troublesome merchants who showed up on these funny-looking ships. As long as they didn't cause too much trouble inland, they were mostly ignored.
But that model, that empire without territory, it must have been fundamentally unstable.
Extremely. And in the 17th century, the whole thing just collapsed with incredible speed.
It does.
The Dutch arrived. They delivered these incredibly precise military and commercial strikes, and Portugal just lost its monopoly, especially on that crucial route to the Spice Islands.
But what's so interesting is that even after the political and economic collapse, the cultural legacy survived.
It really did. The spread of Catholicism, for one thing, that endured. It's why you can still go to the coast today and find people with Portuguese surnames. Almeida, da Costa, da Silva, who, they look Indian, they speak local languages.
But their faith and their family names trace right back to this initial Portuguese wave.
Exactly.
And yet, even Catholicism wasn't, a guarantee of loyalty to the Portuguese crown. Our sources really detailed the friction this created.
Oh, massive friction. Especially after the Inquisition arrived. It was a hugely complicated scene. Well, you had these ancient Malabar Christian communities in the south, right? Their traditions went back to late antiquity. They were initially happy to meet other Christians.
But then the Europeans showed up.
Right. And the Inquisition arrived and started trying to force them to adopt Latin rites, to accept a European hierarchy.
Yeah.
It was this classic clash between a deeply rooted indigenous faith and a very aggressive European cultural import.
And what's just astounding to me is that despite this deep, deep decline starting way back in the 17th century, these little Portuguese holdings, Goa, Daman, Diu, they survived politically all the way until the mid-20th century.
Governing hundreds of thousands of people, Hindus and Christians alike. It's an incredible story of persistence.
So the Portuguese invent the sea route. They invent the trading post model. But the real game changer in the 17th century was the Dutch.
The Dutch, yeah. They arrived ready to basically industrialize with Asian trade.
So how did they do it? How were the Dutch able to just dismantle Portugal's monopoly so quickly?
It was an entirely new business model. The Dutch didn't just have better ships. Their trade was run by the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, a joint stock company.
Right. Our sources note that while the English equivalent was founded around the same time, the VOC fired faster. This was private enterprise replacing the old, slow, royal monopoly model.
And this created this profound collision of economic philosophies. Local Indian rulers, famously, they had a really hard time grasping this new corporate concept.
They couldn't understand who they were supposed to be signing a treaty with.
Exactly. You see it in local documents. They often refer to a Mr. Company, a personified figure, because the idea of a non-royal, immortal, profit-driven legal entity, it was just totally alien to the Mughal imperial structure. Who was this company?
And that just feeds into why they kept underestimating the Europeans.
Precisely. They thought they were just dealing with corporate agents, not the representatives of a future empire.
Now, what's crucial here is that the Dutch weren't primarily focused on India itself, were they?
No, not at all. Their main prize was always the Spice Islands, what's now Indonesia. They used Ceylon, modern Sri Lanka, as their major transshipment hub. They held it for about 150 years and fostered a small Protestant group there called the Burghers.
So in South Asia proper, the Dutch had their trading posts, their factorias, but no real territorial ambitions.
Right. And this leads to a key historical detail that really shatters our modern assumptions about European superiority.
That in the 17th and early 18th centuries, Europeans were not automatically dominant on land.
Not at all. The evidence is clear. We have the famous documented victory of the Travancore Maharaja over a full Dutch expedition.
I love this story. The head of the Dutch force, Admiral Delannoy, he's captured.
He's forced to kneel before the Maharaja, and then he spends the next 2 decades of his life serving the Travancore ruler, training his army. The outcome of these land battles was far from certain.
But this all starts to shift when the French arrive, because they're the ones who invent the blueprint for the territorial colonial empire that the British would later perfect.
The French were the latecomers. They established the French East India Company in the mid-17th century under Louis XIV and his minister, Colbert.
But unlike the Dutch and English companies, which were pretty autonomous, the French company was dangerously dependent on the crown.
Which meant that support from back home ebbed and flowed with whatever political priorities were happening in Versailles.
Then comes the moment everything changed in India, 1707.
The death of the great Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb.
And with his death, the massive Mughal Empire starts to fracture, and it happens with incredible speed. The old, stable structure of getting Firmin's permission to trade from a central authority, that was just gone.
It was replaced by decentralized, messy anarchy. And this raises a new question. Who was actually running the European show on the ground?
It wasn't the cautious board members back in Paris or London.
No, not at all. It was the junior employees, young guys, subordinate sons with no capital, who often started as cabin boys. If they managed to survive the tropical diseases and the duels,
They could end up in senior decision-making roles by their early 20s.
these were inherently radicalized men. They saw the chaos and fragmentation in India not as a problem, but as a vast, untapped opportunity.
And the most important of these adventurous administrators was Joseph Dupleix.
Dupleix, yes. He becomes governor by 1742. He is truly the architect of the territorial system. His crucial innovation wasn't just fighting better.
It was creating and training colonial forces set boys in the European style.
Exactly. Turning Indian recruits into this completely new, devastatingly effective military force.
And all of a sudden, French musketry, French discipline, French tactics,
Right.
it makes the French company the dominant military power in South Asia.
Right. Indian rulers weren't just asking them for trade anymore. They were paying them, and paying them handsomely, for armed mediation in all the endless disputes that followed the Mughal collapse.
And that's the key insight. The whole focus shifts from trade to military leverage.
And Dupleix quickly realized if his company can mediate a succession dispute, they can demand control over the victor's tax collection.
And once you're collecting the taxes, you're effectively a shadow government.
And that dangerous thought starts to creep in. Maybe I should just keep this revenue. Maybe I don't need a king to grant me permission to rule.
By the late 1740s, he had built this enormous self-sustaining empire around Pondicherry. It really could have become the capital of a French colonial India.
But that dream was crushed, not by Indian forces, but by European geopolitics.
The 7 Years' War.
The 7 Years' War, from 1756 to 1763, Dupleix got tragically insufficient support from Paris. They saw the war in India as, well, a secondary theater compared to the fighting in Europe and North America.
And meanwhile, the English, who were always watching, were smart enough to adopt Dupleix's own military blueprint.
They took his model, the trained sepoys, the tax control, and started with their conquest of Bengal. They eventually defeated the French, who lost almost everything. It's the ultimate irony, really.
What's truly fascinating, though, is that even though the French colonial state dissolved, French individuals remained incredibly influential.
Oh, the sources are full of these epic, almost absurd biographies of French mercenaries and adventurers. They offered their services to Indian rulers who were still fighting against the rising power of the British.
The stories were just wild. There's Walter Reinhardt, known as Le Sombre, the gloomy one.
He starts as a simple Dutch company recruit, becomes a professional mercenary, and somehow he ends up ruling his own small principality in the middle of India, which he then bequeathed to his wife.
And that legacy continues right into the 19th century, when the Sikh Maharajas in Punjab, the last independent territory fighting the British, when they want to build a European-style army.
Who do they hire? French veterans from the Napoleonic Wars. Guys like Jean-François Allard, who would serve the Sikh court while dressing like a 17th century French nobleman. It's this bizarre cultural mix.
Even Tipu Sultan, the main British opponent in the south, was actively seeking a French alliance.
He was. In the 1790s, he joined the Jacobin Club, becoming Citizen Tipu, to show his allegiance to liberty, equality, and fraternity.
The principles of the French Revolution. He was trying to link the anti-monarchist struggle in Europe with his own anti-colonial resistance in India.
He desperately wanted France to send real military aid. They sent encouraging letters, a few advisors, but never the decisive naval or troop support that could have actually saved his kingdom.
So even after losing the subcontinent, the French managed to hang on to 5 tiny little enclaves.
Micro-enclaves, really. Pondicherry, Mahé, Caracal, Yanam, and Chandernagore. about 200 square kilometers in total, but they became immensely important.
As places of political asylum.
Exactly. They functioned as a kind of diplomatic safety valve. Yeah. If you were a radical Indian nationalist and the British police were looking for you in Calcutta.
You just crossed the border into the French settlement of Chandernagore.
Right. They had French laws, no extradition to British India. It allowed the nationalist movement to breathe.
Okay, let's jump forward to the 20th century. 1947, British India gains independence.
What happens to these colonial scraps?
The French exit was relatively peaceful. They were facing colonial collapse elsewhere, especially in Vietnam, so they eventually agreed to a transfer.
Which is how we get the Pondicherry Union Territory.
And to this day, you can still see that French cultural influence there. The architecture, the food, even a lingering French language presence.
The Portuguese standoff, however, that was dramatically different, much more stubborn. The right-wing dictator, Antonio Salazar, absolutely refused to cede Goa, Daman, and Du. He saw them as integral parts of Portugal itself.
And his legal rationale was creative.
Very creative. He argued that Albuquerque seized Goa before the Mughal Empire was fully established.
Meaning that India, as the successor state to the Mughals, had no valid legal claim.
Exactly. But the real political stakes for Salazar were enormous. Holding on to Goa was the cornerstone to prevent his entire colonial empire, Angola, Mozambique, Macau, from unraveling. If Goa fell, he was terrified the rest would follow.
Which eventually led to a military resolution in December 1961.
Operation Vijay. The Indian army annexed Goa. Salazar had ordered his troops to fight for every inch, but his commander signed a swift capitulation. Portugal didn't even recognize the annexation until after its own revolution in 1974.
And what's fascinating is what happened after. Goa, though it was integrated politically, fought really hard to maintain its distinctiveness.
It did. It pushed to keep its local language official, to remain a separate state rather than being merged into Maharashtra or Karnataka. Those deep cultural roots from the Portuguese period ended up dictating the political outcome, even after annexation.
And we should briefly mention the minor players.
No, right. The Dutch and the Danes, they eventually just sold their factorias to the British. They saw the writing on the wall.
The Danish legacy is still visible, though, in places like Trankebar in the south. When they sold it, they even put in a clause that the missionary churches and schools they founded had to remain open.
And then there were the Austrians.
The Austrians, yes.
They tried to colonize the Nicobar Islands.
Yeah.
Declare them an imperial possession, but the attempt just failed rapidly.
Right.
The source just notes it was due to the horrendously destructive local climate, which basically wiped out their whole team. Not every European ambition worked out, especially when you're up against jungle diseases.
So when we pull this all together, what does it mean for you, the listener? I mean, the British dominated, yes, but these parallel worlds existed right up until the 1960s.
You had the Portuguese, who created this unique borderland culture that still defines its political future. The Dutch introduced this revolutionary corporate power structure that Indian rulers just could not get their heads around.
And the French. The French invented the military and taxation blueprint that the British then used to conquer the entire subcontinent.
And this leads us to our final provocative thought for you to consider: the shadow of Russia.
The great game.
The great game. The British constantly feared Russian attempts to undermine their control in India, and this fear drove so much of their policy in the 19th century. And it wasn't an abstract fear.
We have records of Russia proposing to open a consulate right in that tiny non-British French enclave of Pondicherry.
Which would have basically been a hostile intelligence post deep inside British India. And we have accounts of disgruntled Indian princes, like the ruler of Indore, promising a massive anti-British uprising if Russian troops just advanced across the border.
So what would have happened?
What would have happened if Russian forces had actually launched one of their many proposed invasions? Or if those Indian princes' offers of alliance had been taken seriously and backed by a major continental power? The European rivalries that played out across the globe were always just a knife edge away from radically changing the map of India itself. It adds this whole other layer of complexity to a history we usually assume was singular and, well, inevitable.